In this final video dealing with the multi-cell model, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the cells that make up this model. Then we're going to look at some other unique characteristics of the cells and the model as a whole. Let's start with the cells that make up the model. There are 3 cells in each hemisphere. Between 0 degrees and 30 degrees is the Hadley cell. Between 60 degrees and each pole is the polar cell. And then between the Hadley and polar cell is our Ferrel cell, and that's between 30 degrees and 60 degrees. We can classify each of these cells as either thermally direct or thermally indirect. Let's first identify what exactly that means. When something is thermally direct, warm air rises and cool or cold air sinks. This should make sense because we understand that warm air is less dense and less dense objects rise, just like boats float on top of the ocean water because they're less dense than the water beneath them. Additionally, cold air, because it's more dense, it sinks, just like a rock sinks in a pond. Thermally indirect is when the opposite of what you expect actually occurs. In this case, it's cool or cold air that rises and warm air that sinks. The reason we call this indirect is because it goes against what we expect to naturally happen. So now back to our cells. Which of the cells are thermally direct? Additionally, which cells, if any, are thermally indirect? Let's start with the Hadley cell. The Hadley cell is a thermally direct circulation. It's between the equator and 30 degrees. If you remember, at the equator, we have the equatorial low at the surface, and if you have a low pressure system at the surface, you get rising motion. At 30 degrees, we have the surface subtropical high, which is sinking motion. So does this meet the description of thermally direct? Even though 30 degrees is still considered pretty warm, the equator is even warmer. So it's all relative. Because where it's warmer, there's rising motion, and where it's relatively cooler, there's sinking motion, the Hadley cell does meet the criteria of being thermally direct. What about the polar cell? The polar cell is also a thermally direct circulation. It's between 60 degrees and the poles. If you remember, at 60 degrees, that's where the subpolar surface low is. And again, because it's a surface low pressure, you have rising motion. At the poles, you have this polar high at the surface. And when you have high pressure at the surface, you have sinking motion. And so 60 degrees latitude is going to be warmer than the poles. And so where it's warmer, we have rising motion, and where it's cooler, we have sinking motion. Again, meeting the definition of thermally direct. That leads us to Ferrel. The Ferrel cell is actually our only thermally indirect circulation. Again, it extends from 30 degrees latitude to 60 degrees latitude. At 30 degrees, remember, we have our surface subtropical high and thus sinking motion. At 60 degrees, we have our subpolar low at the surface and thus rising motion. 30 degrees latitude is closer to the equator than 60 degrees latitude, and therefore 30 degrees latitude is warmer. And in this case, where it's warmer, we have sinking motion, and where it's colder, we have rising motion, which by definition is thermally indirect. Now that we've discussed in detail the multi-cell model, including the cells themselves, I want to talk about how the model actually differs from the real world. Let's take a look at the graphic on the right. The graphic on the right is showing you the ITCZ, or the surface equatorial low. It's showing you it as that black line. There's actually 2 important notes to take from this image. The first thing you'll notice is that the ITCZ actually shifts in latitude with the seasons. In July, when it's the Northern Hemisphere summer season, the ITCZ actually migrates into the Northern Hemisphere. During the winter or January months of the Northern Hemisphere, you're going to see that ITCZ actually dip down into the Southern Hemisphere, where they're experiencing their summer. Another way of wording this is that the ITCZ is actually going to migrate to the area of maximum solar heating. One thing that you can't see from this image is that everything else is going to migrate with it. In July, when the ITCZ migrates towards the Northern Hemisphere, all those other features, the subtropical high, the subpolar low, the polar high, all of those things are actually going to migrate with it. The second thing you may notice from this image is that the ITCZ actually doesn't appear to be that straight belt that we talked about earlier. This actually has to do with land versus ocean. If you'll recall, in the multi-cell model, we had our 2 assumptions. The first assumption was that the Earth is rotating, which is correct. The second assumption, though, was that the Earth is covered entirely by water. That's incorrect, and here we're showing the effects of that. You're actually seeing how the location of these features is going to shift based on the presence or absence of land masses. If we just focus on the ITCZ, and in July in particular, you'll notice it actually migrates into the landmass of Eurasia. You should know from our previous units that land heats to a greater extent and more rapidly than water. And so that's what you're seeing. Because the land is heating up more, the ITCZ is going to follow that area of maximum solar heating. So what we end up with is this jaggedy belt of equatorial lows instead of a straight belt. This is the case with all the other features as well.